The world today is in rapid change. This was starkly illustrated by a survey released this week from the nonpartisan Pew Center in Washington, D.C. that asked over 27,000 people in 26 countries last year what was top of their security concerns. Climate change is the top security concern, followed by Islamist terrorism and cyber attacks. But the Research Center's Spring 2018 Global Attitude Survey found that the largest shift in sentiment centered on the U.S., with a median of 45% of respondents listing U.S. power and influence as a threat, up from 25% in 2013, when Barack Obama was president. Well, this compares with 37% who viewed Russia this way and 35% for China. Perhaps more surprisingly, in 10 of America's traditional allies, including Germany, Japan, and South Korea, roughly half of respondents or more saw U.S. power influence as a major threat, up from 8 in 2017 and 3 in 2013. So what is behind the rising concern about the U.S.? Is this a direct fallout from Donald Trump's America First policy, or are other forces at play here? And join me here in Beijing studio is once again Professor Thye Wu, academic advisor to the Center for China, and from Washington, D.C. is Bernd Schaefer, a professor at George Washington University, and from Tokyo, joined by Kukhee, Choo, a professor of media at cultural studies at Sophia University. So the list of countries most likely to view the U.S. as a threat is topped by two key allies here in Asia Pacific, South Korea and Japan. So I want your take first, Ms. Choo. What do you think is behind this antipathy towards Washington?
Well, first of all, I would actually caution using the word antipathy, because it's not a hatred or a very negative term. It's more about a concern that these two countries are feeling. Yes, caution. And they are feeling concerned, actually, about the United States stance, the current U.S. president's stance, and in some ways the uncertainty that the region is facing vis-a-vis the United States.
And even surprisingly is that some South Koreans consider the U.S. more of a threat than North Koreans, which is quite shocking in the minds of many.
Well, that is because, most likely, because of the U.S. relationship with North Korea, that has been basically unconventional compared to the previous presidents. And that in itself is concerning for South Koreans. So therefore, it is not surprising that they are reacted in this way.
And also, I want your take on this, Mr. Schaefer. Why do you think there is increasing concern about the U.S., and even somebody would consider U.S. as a security threat?
I think the term threat is a bit dramatic. If you look at the actual survey, they asked about power and influence. But yes, it's the U.S. unpredictability, the unpredictability of actions coming from the White House, which make allies wary. We had this just a few days ago with regard to South Korea, when some numbers were floated which were actually not correct with regard to the U.S. military presence and the costs for U.S. military deployment. I think the unpredictability creates uncertainty, and this creates certain anxiety with allies, particularly in South Korea.
And how much has it to do with Trump and his policy?
I think it's primarily statements by the president, which later are then managed and somewhat cleared up by the U.S. Embassy and by the State Department. U.S. diplomacy is still working on a highly professional speed and quality, and once in a while you have some tweets which require some explanations, and this contributes towards the unpredictability.
In Europe, there's increasing tensions between Russia and European countries. But interestingly, some countries consider Washington a bigger threat than Moscow. Among those are some of the allies of the United States, including Australia, Canada, France, and Germany. So, Mr. Wu, are you surprised that the reading of the allies of the U.S. as a security threat?
I think when you talk about security threats, what you mean is that the threat to world peace, rather than invading those countries themselves.
Mm-hmm.
they see the U.S. as a threat to world peace, largely because at the present juncture of North Koreans' attempt to develop long-range missiles and expand its nuclear arsenal. This is the time for the U.S. this is the last chance for the U.S. to put a stop to North Korea's ability to threaten continental United States. If North Korea already has the ability to launch long-range missiles, then the United States would not be a threat to the world peace. We are at a juncture, regardless of who the U.S. president is. This is the U.S. last chance to stop the North Koreans from having that capability.
And Mr. Schaefer, do you think the decision makers in Washington care much about whether it is regarded as a threat to the rest of the world or not, if they happen to read the survey of Pew?
It depends about which decision makers you are talking about. I think in the U.S. State Department and U.S. diplomacy is concerned about it. The White House has maybe a different perception. So you have ongoing debates in the administration whether this is actually a source of concern, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And I don't think you have a uniform line on this in the U.S. administration. On the other hand, they really don't care this much about polls. I don't think in the White House they will take a lot of time to study the Pew Research poll.
And do you think this is just because Trump's policy, his philosophy about how to interact with the rest of the world, or there is something deeper there about Americans' thinking about his relations with the world?
I think it will be very important how the 2020 U.S. presidential election will turn out, whether we will have this as a trend or just an exception, or whether there will be a change in perceptions of the U.S. I think the next 2 years will give a lot of answers on that. And I think currently the world is still treating it sort of as an exception, but if 2020 confirms this trend we see currently, then it will have really long-term consequences, yes.
I want Ms. Choo to weigh in on the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Since 2013, concern about the North Korea has fallen substantially in South Korea from 82% to now to 67% in 2018. And it seems President Trump has been doing a lot of reaching out to North Koreans, although there hasn't been a deal yet. But do you think it is less a threat to the world than, say, 5 years ago?
Well, actually, North Korea has followed a certain pattern of basically attempting to threaten the world with this nuclear deal, and always there has been a conventional way that the world dealt with North Korea. For example, behind the backdoor scenes where they, they would receive funding for various other areas. So in that sense, I don't think that North Korea has really changed. I think the U.S. has changed its stance in dealing with North Korea, which is concerning, especially to South Koreans, because the provocation that the U.S. president keeps on continuing had actually threatened the sensibility of the security,
what is the provocative part
of
the U.S.?
I think it's the rhetoric that the U.S. president has been uttering often, like, for example, the fire and fury comments. And even though...
But he has turned an about-face on that already in 2018. Yes. He reached out to North Koreans and talked with Kim Jong-un.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So even though... Yes, but that is more for a domestic, in some ways a performative domestic, the audience, as the previous section has talked about. Donald Trump is popular in the United States to a certain demographic, and for them, the president is actually reaching out. However, does that really make a deal, or does it reach a deal to really halt its nuclear programs? We have, we have to see this in a long-term vision, so I think there is a concern there still.
Yeah.
Mr. Wu, your take?
There are two separate things here. One is tell the North Koreans, you cannot have a nuclear bomb. The second thing you can do is you can have the nuclear bomb, but you cannot have long-range missiles. And I think the final outcome would be restrictions on the long-range missiles that the North Koreans would have.
But we will stomach the scenario that that Pyongyang will have nuclear power, but not intercontinental ballistic missiles.
In other words, continental USA.
That will only satisfy the U.S.
Well,
not South Korea, China, Japan, and Russia.
Well, it'll be interesting to see that since the North Koreans already have medium-range missiles, which means that China is well within its capability of a strike. So this, in a way, ensure that there would be a balanced position between China and North Korea. So
another thing is that, Mr. Schaefer, many people say Trump hasn't been really tested in a crisis of international magnitude. That's why people are uncertain about the future. That's why people consider the U.S. as a potential threat. Do you think that makes sense?
Not really. I don't think whether we want to have international crisis, to have the U.S. president tested to determine whether he's a threat or not. We just have to work hard to avoid international crisis, and so far the United States has managed that as well as others. As you remember, just about 1 year ago, we were almost at the brink of a military conflict at the Korean Peninsula, and then Trump did the turnaround of about 180 degrees. Now we're in a quite different situation. So currently, I think we are far from an international crisis in this regard, and with the U.S. presidential elections coming up, I think the danger is pretty low that we will see an international crisis in which the United States will be involved.
So it's a safer world because of America?
That's what you said. I think many countries in this world have a responsibility to make the world safe, and it's not just the United States, but all the others. But the United States, of course, obviously plays a major part because it's the largest military power. So all eyes are actually directed towards what the United States is doing. But let's say it again, compared to what we had 1 year ago, we are now in a better situation.
We're better 1 year ago. Thank you very much. We're running out of time. Thank you, Mr. Schaefer, and thank you, Ms. Choo and Mr. Wu, for your analysis here.
Right.
And you've been watching The Point with Liu Xin here on CGTN. I'm Zoe. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.